Ladies and gentlemen, emotional neglect doesn't leave bruises or scars you can point to. It leaves questions. Why do I feel invisible? Why do I second guess my worth? Why does silence hurt so much? The truth is, being dismissed emotionally, whether by family, a partner, or even a friend, can be one of the most damaging forms of disconnection. It's subtle, often unintentional, but it teaches us that our needs are too much, our feelings are inconvenient, and our presence is optional. In this conversation, we'll explore 8 behaviors that quietly reveal emotional neglect, what Brené Brown might call the quiet trauma, and why naming it is the first step toward reclaiming your voice, your worth, and your emotional safety. Emotional neglect isn't always dramatic or obvious. In fact, what makes it so difficult to identify is that it's not about what someone does to you, it's about what they consistently fail to do. It's not a loud argument or an act of betrayal. It's the silence after you share your feelings. It's the blank stare when you cry. It's the absence of empathy in the moments when you most need someone to say, I see you, I hear you, you matter. And that absence over time becomes a form of abandonment, one that seeps into your sense of self and shapes how you view your worth, your voice, and your right to be cared for. Emotional neglect tells you over and over again that your needs don't matter. And because it's often subtle or unspoken, many people internalize the pain instead of naming it. We're wired for connection. Neurobiologically, emotionally, spiritually, we long to be seen and valued. It's a basic human need. Emotional neglect doesn't attack that need directly. Instead, it ignores it until we start to doubt we ever deserved it in the first place. When someone is physically present but emotionally absent, it creates a type of disconnection that's especially hard to articulate. You can be sitting next to someone every day and still feel completely alone. And that loneliness in the presence of others is often more painful than being physically alone. You start to feel like you don't belong even in your own relationships. This absence of response, this lack of acknowledgement, often begins in subtle ways. Maybe you tried to express your feelings growing up and were told to toughen up, or that others had it worse. Maybe you reached out for comfort and were met with distraction, indifference, or discomfort. Over time, those unmet bids for connection teach your nervous system not to expect emotional safety. You adapt, you go quiet, you stop expressing yourself. Not because you don't feel things, but because you've learned that your feelings won't be met with care. You begin to regulate your emotions alone, even when your soul is aching for support. That's not resilience, that's survival, and it comes at a cost. The wounds of emotional neglect often manifest in adulthood as chronic self-doubt, people-pleasing, or emotional numbness. You might feel like you're too much for wanting to be heard or not enough to be truly valued. These beliefs are not flaws in your character. They're coping mechanisms, born from experiences where your emotional presence was not acknowledged or valued. The body remembers what the mind tries to rationalize. You might not remember every moment of being dismissed, but your nervous system does. You feel it in the hesitation before you speak, the fear of being vulnerable, the instinct to downplay your feelings. It's not because you're broken, it's because you adapted to being unseen. This kind of neglect can slowly erode trust, not just trust in others, but trust in yourself. When someone repeatedly fails to respond to your emotional cues, it can make you question your own reality. Maybe I'm overreacting, you tell yourself, or maybe I just need to stop being so sensitive. But those thoughts often come from a place of not having your emotional world mirrored or validated. And validation isn't about agreement, it's about acknowledgement. It's someone saying, I get that you're hurting, or that makes sense. Without it, you're left to make sense of everything on your own, and that's an exhausting, isolating place to live. The absence of emotional connection often stems not from malice, but from the other person's inability to be emotionally present. Maybe they never learned how. Maybe they were never given permission to feel themselves. But knowing that doesn't heal the impact. Being told they did the best they could may offer some perspective, but it doesn't erase the pain of growing up or living in a relationship where your emotions felt like an inconvenience. Compassion for others doesn't require you to diminish your own experience. You can hold both truths. They struggled to love you well, and you deserve to be loved better. This kind of emotional neglect can lead to internalized shame. Shame that tells you that you're hard to love or that your emotions are a burden, but your emotions were never the problem. The problem was the emotional vacuum you were left to grow in, a vacuum where love wasn't expressed, comfort wasn't given, and connection wasn't consistent. And in that kind of vacuum, even the most emotionally intuitive people can begin to feel like they're invisible. That invisibility doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. It's the ache of a need that was never properly met. And acknowledging that ache doesn't mean you're ungrateful or dramatic. It means you're finally telling the truth. Emotional neglect is often hidden behind the mask of normalcy. It doesn't usually look like cruelty or abuse. It looks like someone saying, I didn't do anything wrong, and meaning it. And that's exactly the issue. Emotional neglect is defined by what isn't done. It's the lack of emotional presence, the silence when comfort is needed, the failure to respond when vulnerability is offered. When people are dismissive of your emotional needs, they often do it in subtle, socially acceptable ways. They might minimize your pain, change the subject, make a joke, or simply say nothing at all. These behaviors send a clear message over time. Your emotions don't matter here. And what's dangerous is that it becomes easy to question yourself instead of the environment you're in. Dismissiveness doesn't have to come in an overtly toxic package. It can show up in people who are polite, charming, and even well-meaning. That's what makes it so disorienting. You might find yourself trying to justify their behavior. They're just busy, or they're not good with emotions. And maybe that's true, but the outcome remains the same. You feel unseen. When someone constantly brushes past your pain, avoids deep conversations, or sidesteps emotional responsibility, they're not just being forgetful. They're choosing emotional distance. And over time, that distance becomes a wall you learn to live behind. Being around dismissive people can cause a subtle kind of erosion. Not the dramatic crumbling that grabs attention, but the slow wearing away of your confidence in your own feelings. You start hesitating before you speak. You begin filtering your emotions, only sharing what feels safe or acceptable. You might even start convincing yourself that your pain is exaggerated or illegitimate. This isn't a coincidence, it's conditioning. When people around you consistently fail to respond with empathy, your internal compass starts to malfunction. You stop trusting your gut. You stop reaching out. And instead of asking for help, you start apologizing for needing it. There's a unique kind of hurt that comes from being emotionally dismissed. It's not just that your feelings aren't acknowledged, it's that they're actively avoided or diminished. You might hear phrases like, don't make a big deal out of it, just move on, or why are you still talking about that? These statements aren't neutral, they're shutting you down. They imply that your emotional reality is too much or not important enough to be explored. And when this happens regularly, it teaches you to internalize the belief that expressing your emotions is a risk rather than a right. What complicates this experience is that dismissive people rarely think of themselves as harmful. In fact, many of them believe they're being helpful. They may see their emotional detachment as maturity or strength. They might pride themselves on being rational, level-headed, or calm. But emotional intelligence is not about eliminating emotion. It's about being able to stay present in the face of it. Dismissing someone else's pain under the guise of logic or control isn't strength. It's emotional avoidance. And avoidance is contagious. If you spend enough time with someone who avoids emotion, you'll eventually start doing it too. The pain of being dismissed is amplified when it comes from people we care about: parents, partners, friends. These are the people we expect to hold space for us, to make room for our truth, to meet us in our moments of vulnerability. When they don't, it's more than just a missed opportunity for connection. It's a violation of trust. We begin to learn that vulnerability isn't safe, that expressing ourselves leads to discomfort, rejection, or silence. And so we start to protect ourselves by becoming emotionally unavailable, not because we want to be, but because we no longer feel safe being anything else. The most confusing part is the inconsistency. Maybe the person who dismisses you sometimes listens, just not often. Maybe they offer brief moments of connection, only to retreat again into detachment. This emotional inconsistency creates a pattern of unpredictability that makes you hold out hope. You think, maybe if I phrase it differently, they'll respond, or maybe next time will be different. This hope keeps you in a cycle of emotional gambling, where you keep investing in someone who rarely shows up emotionally. And when they don't, instead of walking away, you try harder. You silence more of yourself. You shrink to fit the space they're willing to give. And that shrinking becomes a form of emotional self-neglect. It's important to understand that being dismissed doesn't mean you're wrong for feeling what you feel. Your emotions are valid even when they're inconvenient for someone else. The pain of not being met where you are is real. And the longer you endure dismissive behavior, the more it chips away at your sense of emotional security. You begin to feel emotionally homeless, like there's no safe space to land, no one willing to hold your truth without minimizing it. And that homelessness doesn't just live in your relationships, it starts to live inside you. You carry it in your nervous system, in your patterns of communication, in the way you respond to intimacy. Naming dismissiveness for what it is the first step toward breaking the cycle. It's not about blaming or shaming others, it's about becoming honest with yourself about what you've experienced and what you deserve. Emotional connection is not a luxury, it's a fundamental human need. And being dismissed repeatedly is not just frustrating, it's harmful. It teaches you that your emotional needs are too much, that your pain is a problem, and that your voice should stay quiet. But you were never meant to live a life where your feelings are a burden. You were meant to be met, to be heard, and to be held. Inconsistency and emotional availability can be one of the most disorienting and damaging experiences in any relationship. It's not about someone being cruel all the time or always ignoring you. In fact, the hardest part is that they're sometimes there. Sometimes they show up, they listen, they hold space, and it feels safe. But then without warning, they pull away, go silent, or become cold. This pattern of unpredictability doesn't just create confusion, it creates deep, long-lasting self-doubt. It's hard to know where you stand, not because you don't care, but because the ground keeps shifting beneath you. You begin to question your instincts, your expectations, and eventually your worth. Emotional inconsistency is a subtle form of neglect because it sends mixed messages. One day you feel seen and heard, and the next day you feel like a ghost in your own relationship. This back and forth creates emotional whiplash, and instead of recognizing the other person's inconsistency, you start wondering what you did wrong. Maybe I said something that upset them. Maybe I'm too needy. Or maybe I should just be more understanding. These thoughts don't arise from clarity. They're born from confusion and unmet emotional needs. And over time, they turn into internalized narratives that reshape how you view yourself and how you show up in relationships. Most heartbreaking about emotional inconsistency is that it doesn't feel like neglect at first. It feels like hope. When someone is occasionally available, it gives you just enough connection to believe that maybe if you do things right, that connection will stay. This is the trap. You start working harder, trying to anticipate their emotional shifts, adjusting your behavior to keep them close. You become hyper-aware of their moods, reading between the lines of every message, analyzing their tone, their silences, their body language. Your focus becomes so consumed by their behavior that you lose touch with your own needs, and slowly, without realizing it, you begin to abandon yourself. This pattern is exhausting. It creates anxiety because it places your emotional security in the hands of someone unreliable. You don't know what version of them you'll get from day to day. And that uncertainty doesn't just create discomfort, it creates a low-level chronic stress that your nervous system starts to normalize. You might find yourself walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing, or express the wrong emotion. You shrink, you silence yourself, you suppress your needs, not because you want to, but because it feels safer than being met with indifference or withdrawal. You learn that stability isn't something you can expect, so you stop expecting it altogether. People who are emotionally inconsistent often don't realize the harm they cause. They might not be intentionally hurtful. In fact, they may believe they're doing their best. But emotional connection requires more than moments of presence. It requires reliability. Love is not just about intensity or passion or even care. It's about being dependable. When someone is emotionally hot and cold, they teach you that love is conditional, that you have to earn it over and over again, that you have to perform, be perfect, never ask too much, never feel too deeply. And that belief doesn't stay confined to one relationship. It follows you everywhere. The result of this dynamic is that you become unsure of your right to feel what you feel. You start to internalize the idea that your emotional experiences are somehow wrong or excessive. This is how self-doubt takes root, not as a loud, clear thought, but as a quiet, persistent undercurrent. You second-guess yourself constantly. You hesitate to speak up, to ask for reassurance, to express hurt. You become the person who says it's fine when it's not, because history has taught you that being honest doesn't guarantee you'll be held. And in that silence, you slowly forget what it's like to feel safe. There is something uniquely painful about trying to love someone who is emotionally unpredictable. You invest so much energy trying to understand them, trying to soothe the instability, trying to make the connection last. You end up carrying the emotional weight for both of you. And while you may occasionally get glimpses of the connection you long for, those moments are often not enough to compensate for the constant emotional labor. Still, you stay, because you remember the good moments. You hold on to the hope that those moments will return, that the inconsistency will stabilize. But hope without consistency isn't connection, it's survival. Consistency and emotional availability isn't a luxury, it's a requirement for healthy relationships. When someone is emotionally consistent, you can relax. You can be yourself without fear of sudden withdrawal or silence. You don't have to constantly monitor the emotional climate. You don't have to filter your words or overanalyze every interaction. You can just be. And that kind of emotional safety allows you to grow, to open up, to thrive. It's not about perfection, it's about presence. Not sometimes, not when it's convenient, but as a pattern of care and engagement that builds trust over time, gets overlooked in emotionally inconsistent relationships, is the way they rewire our sense of worth. You begin to associate love with anxiety. You come to believe that instability is normal. And when that belief sets in, it doesn't just affect how you relate to others, it affects how you relate to yourself. You start to view your emotions as unreliable. You disconnect from your intuition. You question your every move. The emotional seesaw you're forced to ride with another person turns into an internal seesaw you ride alone. And when you're caught in that loop, it becomes very difficult to believe that love can feel calm, steady, and mutual. But it can. You just haven't been shown how yet. One of the most painful forms of emotional neglect comes through a consistent failure to validate your inner world. It's when the people closest to you don't just miss your emotions, they dismiss them. And not always with harsh words or cruel intentions. Often it's with subtle shrugs, vague responses, or that familiar glazed-over look that tells you they've already stopped listening. Over time, this kind of emotional void leaves you feeling like your experiences are too much, your pain is too dramatic, and your joy is too inconvenient. You start to question not just your feelings, but whether you even deserve to feel them. Emotional invalidation doesn't just hurt in the moment, it rewrites the way you relate to yourself. Validation is a simple yet powerful human need. It's not about agreement or fixing anything, it's about acknowledgement. When someone says, "That sounds really hard," or "I can see why you feel that way," they are meeting you in your emotional reality. It creates safety.
It tells you that your experiences make sense, that your emotions are not a problem to solve but a truth to honor. But when that validation is missing, especially in key relationships, you begin to internalize the belief that your emotional truth is either wrong or irrelevant. You begin to shrink your voice to fit the space they're willing to give. You start editing your own story as you tell it, trimming out anything that might seem too intense or uncomfortable for them. The absence of validation creates a relationship dynamic where you are constantly evaluating your own experiences through someone else's emotional tolerance. If they don't respond, you assume you've said too much. If they get uncomfortable, you decide you're being unreasonable. You shape your emotional expression around their reactions, not because you're weak, but because you're trying to preserve connection. The tragedy is, in doing so, you abandon yourself.
You leave parts of your experience unspoken, unacknowledged, and eventually unrecognized by even you. The longer you live like this, the more emotionally disoriented you become. You begin to wonder what's real and what's imagined, not because you're unstable, but because no one ever mirrored your emotional truth back to you in a consistent and compassionate way. What makes this kind of neglect especially insidious is that it's often subtle. It's a raised eyebrow when you share something important. It's a distracted when you open up. It's the conversation that moves quickly past your grief or your excitement or your worry. These are not overt rejections, but they still wound, because what they say underneath is, this doesn't matter enough to pause for. And when your feelings are repeatedly met with dismissal, whether it's silence, sarcasm, or quick fix advice, it trains your brain to mute them. You learn to suppress what you feel rather than risk the hurt of being ignored. Children who grow up without emotional validation often become adults who don't trust their emotional compass. They second-guess themselves constantly, wondering if they're overreacting or being too sensitive. This isn't a personality flaw, it's a response to years of emotional gaslighting, even if unintentional. When you're repeatedly told or shown that your feelings are invalid, you start to distrust your inner voice. You may find yourself needing others to confirm what you feel before you believe it. You may struggle with setting boundaries because you're unsure if your discomfort is real enough to justify them. That doubt can become paralyzing, especially in relationships where emotional safety is still missing. There is a kind of loneliness that comes not from being physically alone, but from feeling emotionally unseen. It's the isolation that sets in when you're surrounded by people who don't truly hear you. You may look fine on the outside, functioning, social, productive, but internally you're carrying unmetabolized emotions that have nowhere to land. And that emotional weight doesn't disappear. It turns into exhaustion, anxiety, or numbness. It might show up as a deep sadness you can't explain or a sudden anger that feels out of proportion. These emotions are not irrational. They're echoes of every time you needed someone to show up emotionally and they didn't. Emotional validation is absent for long enough. It changes how you show up in the world. You may become emotionally avoidant, telling yourself it's easier not to feel than to risk feeling alone in your pain again. Or you might become hypervigilant, always scanning for rejection, always bracing for the moment your emotions become too much. In both cases, the wound is the same, a deep longing to be seen, to be understood, and to be held in your full humanity. That longing is not weakness, it's the imprint of a need that was never fully met. What makes healing from this form of neglect so challenging is that the people who invalidated your emotions may not even recognize what they did. They might claim they were being logical, calm, or objective. They might say things like, I didn't think it was a big deal, or I didn't want to upset you more. But emotional presence isn't about having the perfect words. It's about being willing to sit with someone's truth, even when it's messy or uncomfortable. The pain of not receiving that kind of presence isn't about being overly emotional. It's about being emotionally alone. You are not too sensitive for wanting to be seen. You are not dramatic for needing to be heard. Emotional validation is not a bonus or a luxury. It's a vital part of human connection. And when it's missing, the damage is quiet but profound. Naming that absence is the first act of reclaiming your truth, because your emotions don't need to be justified, they need to be honored. And you deserve relationships where your inner world isn't something to be managed, but something to be met. Someone consistently fails to take responsibility for how their actions affect others emotionally, it creates a quiet but corrosive kind of damage. This isn't about expecting perfection or asking people to never make mistakes. It's about the unwillingness to acknowledge harm, to say, yes, I see what I did and how it hurt you. Emotional neglect often comes in the form of absence, but sometimes it comes through avoidance, especially the avoidance of accountability. When people sidestep their impact, they don't just preserve their own comfort, they erase your experience in the process. You end up carrying the weight of both the hurt and the denial. This kind of behavior can be deeply invalidating. Imagine expressing how someone's words made you feel small or unseen, only to have them respond with defensiveness, sarcasm, or even silence. Or worse, they turn the blame around, making it about your tone, your sensitivity, or your timing. These aren't just deflections. They're tools that shift emotional responsibility away from the person who caused harm and back onto the person who was hurt. And when this happens repeatedly, it doesn't just break trust. It teaches you that your pain is inconvenient, that bringing it up makes you the problem, that silence is safer than honesty. Emotional accountability is missing. There's often an imbalance. One person becomes the emotional caretaker, always trying to fix, explain, soothe, or forgive. The other remains emotionally protected, rarely examining themselves, rarely offering repair. Over time, this dynamic becomes exhausting. It conditions you to accept one-sided healing, where your wounds are your responsibility and their impact is your burden to carry. You start apologizing for bringing up hurt at all. You minimize your emotions so they won't feel accused. And eventually, you stop reaching for connection altogether because it starts to feel like confrontation. What complicates this further is that people who avoid accountability often present themselves as kind, reasonable, or even nurturing. They may do things for you, support you in practical ways, or claim to care deeply. But emotional responsibility isn't about checking boxes or being helpful on the surface. It's about facing discomfort when someone says, "This hurt me." It's about resisting the instinct to defend and instead leaning into understanding. When someone refuses to do that, no matter how kind they appear otherwise, they are keeping the relationship emotionally shallow. You may feel cared for in theory, but not in reality, because real care includes the willingness to acknowledge harm, even unintentional harm, and make space for repair. Being around someone who doesn't own their emotional impact causes you to question your own perceptions. You start replaying events, wondering if you misread something or overreacted. This internal interrogation isn't because you're unstable. It's because your emotional reality isn't being affirmed externally. You end up doing both roles, the one who's been hurt and the one who must also validate that hurt. That split within yourself can create deep emotional fatigue. You never get to rest in the safety of being understood. Instead, you live in a constant loop of self-analysis, searching for proof that what you felt was real and worthy of attention. One of the most difficult aspects of this dynamic is the isolation it creates. When someone won't acknowledge your pain, they isolate you in it. You may be physically together, but emotionally you're completely alone. And in that space, you learn to mute yourself. You say less, you shrink. You internalize the idea that emotional expression leads to disconnection rather than closeness. And so you begin performing stability, smiling when you're hurt, staying quiet when something stings, brushing off what you need because asking feels like a risk. It's not that your emotions disappear, they just stop feeling safe to share. People who avoid responsibility often do so because they're uncomfortable with vulnerability. Owning your emotional impact means admitting you got it wrong, that you hurt someone, even unintentionally. That's a vulnerable place to be. But it's also where real intimacy lives. Without accountability, there's no depth. Without repair, there's no resilience. And without mutual emotional responsibility, love becomes lopsided, something that is given, not exchanged. It becomes a performance rather than a partnership. And you, in the midst of it, become the emotional scapegoat for everything that's not working, even when you're the one trying to build connection. Healing from this kind of emotional neglect means learning to recognize when you're carrying emotional weight that doesn't belong to you. It means noticing when someone's discomfort is being used as a shield to avoid facing their actions. It's about reclaiming your right to say, "This hurt," without needing to prove it, justify it, or soften it for someone else's comfort. Your pain doesn't have to be perfect to be valid, and someone's inability to hear it doesn't make it less real. Their silence doesn't erase your story. Their denial doesn't rewrite what happened. The first step toward healing is naming what was missing: acknowledgement, repair, shared responsibility. These are not extra features of love. They are the foundation. And when they're not present, what's built on top may look like connection, but it will never feel like home. Because home is not just a place where you're accepted when you're easy to love. It's a place where you're still held when you're hurting, still heard when you're upset, still seen when you're not at your best. Emotional accountability is the bridge between harm and healing. Without it, we stay stuck in cycles of misunderstanding, distance, and silence. One of the most overlooked but deeply wounding aspects of emotional neglect is the absence of genuine curiosity. When someone is emotionally invested in you, they don't just tolerate your presence. They seek to understand your inner world. They ask about your thoughts, your fears, your hopes, your past. They lean in, not out. But when that curiosity is missing, when the people closest to you show no real interest in what makes you who you are, it sends a clear and painful message: you are not worth the effort to know. It's a silent dismissal, a quiet turning away that's easy to rationalize on the surface but devastating underneath. Because when no one asks, you begin to question whether you matter at all. Genuine curiosity is one of the most intimate expressions of love. It says, "I want to understand you, not just coexist with you." It means asking questions without judgment, listening without interruption, staying present even when the answer isn't simple or easy. When that's absent, What remains is a relationship built on assumption and surface. You might go through the motions together, handle responsibilities, share a home or a routine, but your emotional reality stays locked inside you. And what hurts the most isn't that no one knows you, it's that no one wants to. The absence of curiosity often shows up in subtle ways. It's the friend who always talks but never listens, the partner who asks how your day was but tunes out the moment you begin to share, the family member who only reaches out when they need something. Over time, these interactions teach you that your inner life is not a place others want to visit, so you stop inviting them in. You start offering the edited version of your story, the one that's easy to hear, quick to say, and safe enough not to create discomfort. But in doing so, you lose connection, not just with others, but with yourself. Curiosity is lacking. It doesn't just limit communication, it starves intimacy. Without it, conversations become transactional rather than transformational. You speak to be polite, not to connect. You share facts, not feelings. And even when you're physically close to someone, emotionally you're miles apart. The relationship may appear functional, but it's hollow. There's no depth, no rootedness, no sense of being truly known. And that lack of emotional inquiry isn't neutral, it's deeply telling. It signals where their energy flows and where it doesn't. If they're not curious about you, they're not connected to you in the way that matters most. Children raised without emotional curiosity often grow into adults who are unsure whether their stories matter. They become skilled at reading the room, at molding themselves to fit in, at saying what's expected, but they rarely get to feel the freedom of expressing their full, unfiltered selves. That kind of chronic self-editing doesn't just cause emotional fatigue, it fractures identity. You start to confuse silence with strength, invisibility with safety. You forget what it feels like to be asked, "What do you think? How do you feel? What's it like for you?" And without those questions, you never get to fully form the answers. Being in a relationship, romantic, familial, or platonic, where you are not asked about your experience, creates a profound loneliness. It's the ache of being surrounded by people, yet feeling emotionally exiled. You might tell yourself it's fine, that you don't need much, that you're just private. But under that rationalization is often a quieter truth. You stopped expecting others to care because they rarely did. You adjusted your emotional needs to match their emotional availability. You told yourself you were asking for too much, when really you were just asking to be known. Curiosity is the gateway to empathy. When someone wants to understand your emotions, they get a glimpse of the world through your eyes. That creates connection. That's how trust is built, not by agreement or approval, but by mutual engagement. When curiosity is missing, misunderstanding becomes the default. People misinterpret your silence, your sadness, your strength, and without interest in clarification, they never correct those assumptions. You end up not just misunderstood, but misrepresented. And every time that happens, it chips away at your sense of self. The most painful part is often that you still hope, you still wish they'd ask. You drop hints, you open small doors, you try again, despite past disappointments. But when curiosity is never reciprocated, when your vulnerability is met with apathy or blankness, the hurt becomes cumulative. You stop sharing, not because you don't have anything to say, but because you've learned that saying it changes nothing. There's a kind of heartbreak that comes from realizing someone has access to your life, but no interest in your heart. You are not asked about your experiences. You begin to internalize the belief that they are not significant, that you must process alone, that your feelings are burdens, not bridges. You carry them quietly, skillfully, and invisibly, but they weigh you down. You become the kind of person who is always there for others, but feels like no one ever really sees you, not because you're hiding, but because no one ever thought to look. Healing begins when you recognize that your story matters, even if no one ever asked for it, that your thoughts, feelings, and memories are worth exploring, not just by others, but by yourself. You can begin to turn that curiosity inward, asking the questions others failed to ask. You can also begin to surround yourself with people who lean in, who notice when something's off, who want to know you beyond the surface. You deserve to be known, not just for what you do or how you serve, but for who you are at your most honest, most tender, most human. Emotional neglect often hides in plain sight, not in loud arguments or explosive betrayals, but in what's missing, the validation that never came, the accountability never taken, the curiosity never shown. It's a quiet erosion of worth, built over time through small dismissals, subtle silences, and unmet needs. When the people we count on most consistently fail to show up for our emotional reality, we begin to disconnect, not just from them, but from ourselves. We mute our voice, question our feelings, and shrink our presence to fit the emotional space we're allowed. But healing begins with naming what was never given. When we finally recognize emotional neglect for what it is, not a flaw in us, but an absence in them, we can stop apologizing for our pain and start reclaiming the wholeness that was always ours to begin with. We are not too much. We were simply unseen by those who chose not to look deeper. And now we choose differently for ourselves, our healing, and our future.